I'm on the middle of page 188. Mr. Martin had gotten away again. He had told Myrtle to stay at home, but Myrtle, who was sick of Dead Horse Alley and of Mrs. Reddy's hints that Myrtle ought to be in some sort of institute, instead of traveling around with a suspicious-looking white man, followed him. They went back down 6th Avenue toward Capitol Hill, then around the hill and along Union Street towards the Hermitage. It was Saturday night and the streets were crowded. There were white people everywhere, some with yellow or red roses and some without. Some were driving in open automobiles, stopping in the middle of the street to talk to passers-by and holding up traffic. Horns honked. The music of a player piano came from an open doorway, a song that had been popular as long as Myrtle could remember. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I brought him to be my pride and joy. Who dares to place a musket on his shoulder to shoot some other mother's darling boy? Myrtle would have liked to sing along, but she had to keep silent because she was busy turning invisible. She wove through the crowds and no one saw her. Then Mr. Martin went into the Hermitage. Colored people weren't allowed inside, and it was much more difficult to be invisible in places you weren't allowed to be. There was a doorman with a double row of gold buttons on his coat. Myrtle retreated. There was another entrance around the side. There was a doorman here, too, but a group of suffragists with yellow ribbons on their hats went in, and Myrtle slipped silently in with them. The desk clerk at the Hermitage was much too harassed to see Myrtle. The lobby was full of white people, all talking loudly. Myrtle slid in among them, concentrating as hard as she could on being invisible. They were busy talking to each other and talking about each other. Myrtle could feel their gazes slide around her. She was doing a good job. There was a quiet area with some potted ferns and cut velvet sofas. It looked like a good place for Mr. Martin to be hiding. A man and a woman were sitting on one of the sofas talking, but they weren't Miss Chloe and Mr. Martin. "I've just come from the train station, Mr. Hanover," the woman was saying. "We had to let some of the legislators leave town. After all, it's the weekend. But we're afraid that those who won't accept a bribe to change their vote might accept a bribe to just stay home and go home and stay there." A tall, bony man with tufts of gray hair in his ears came over to them. "Joe, evening, Miss White." He nodded vaguely at the lady. "Joe, I gotta tell you, you know that leak in my barn roof?" Mr. Hanover looked wary and put a hand over his stomach as though it hurt. "You have a leak in your barn roof?" "Yeah. Well, them antis offered me $300 to vote against ratification. You know I'm with the Suffs, Joe. I've been with the Suffs since way back. But $300, and with that leak in the roof." He trailed off and looked at Joe hopefully. $300? Mr. Hanover sounded outraged. "That's all they offered you? Everyone else who votes with the antis is getting $1,000. $1,000? The legislator stared. $1,000 and they offered me a measly $300 for my vote? Those lousy no-good antis, what do they take me for? Forget them." The man stalked off, and Miss White and Mr. Hanover laughed. Myrtle would have liked to laugh too, but you couldn't do that when you were invisible. Mr. Hanover suddenly grabbed his stomach again and winced. "Can't wait to tell Mrs. Cat about that," he said. "That was funny." Myrtle edged carefully out into the lobby again. Mr. Martin was nowhere to be seen. He would be looking for Miss Chloe, of course. Myrtle was afraid that if she didn't manage things right, Miss Chloe was going to be Mr. Martin's downfall. Myrtle slid along invisibly to a room that she could tell from the sounds and from the gravy smells must be the dining room. She couldn't go inside since she didn't trust her invisibility walking past that white-suited white headwaiter. She peered in the door as best she could. She didn't see Mr. Martin. She slid back into the lobby. She climbed up the stone staircase to the balcony. She had gone up there to get a better view, but the balcony was full of people wearing red roses. One woman looked directly at Myrtle. Thinking fast, Myrtle whipped out her handkerchief, dropped to her knees, and began dusting the balcony railing. At the Girls' Training Institute, they had always been sticklers for dusting railings and that sort of detail. At least that's what Myrtle remembered from the few classes she'd bothered to attend. Anyway, it worked. As soon as she started dusting, she became invisible again. Down below, Myrtle saw Mr. Martin crossing the lobby with Miss Chloe on his arm. They went up a little staircase to a veranda at the front of the lobby. Myrtle hurriedly pocketed her handkerchief and went back downstairs to follow them. The veranda was made of stone, with a vaulted stone ceiling. It stretched the length of the hotel, along 6th Avenue. Down below, Myrtle could hear automobiles and a few horses passing, and the voices of people in the street. There was nobody on the veranda but Mr. Martin and Miss Chloe and a very old white lady wearing an enormous hat. The old lady was approaching Miss Chloe. Myrtle moved toward them cautiously. Just then Violet came onto the veranda and ruined everything by saying, "Hi, Myrtle." Everyone turned to look at Myrtle. "Hi," said Myrtle, very annoyed. "What is this?" the old lady demanded. "Mrs. Cat, this is my friend Theo Martin," said Miss Chloe, looking tired, "and my sister Violet, and her little friend Myrtle." "Your sister seems to be an anti," said Mrs. Cat. "I'm not an anti, Mrs. Cat," said Violet, covering her red rose. "I'm just wearing this. In fact, I wanted to tell Chloe." "Preposterous," said Mrs. Cat, "just wearing the anti-suffrage rose. Do you have any idea how many women have lived their whole lives, yes, and died too, for your right to vote, and you're just wearing an anti-suffrage rose?" Mr. Martin looked at the old lady with interest. "You must be Carrie Chapman Catt. I would be honored to shake your hand." He grabbed her hand and shook it, which Myrtle thought was brave of him, considering the way Mrs. Cat was glaring at him. "You're a Bolshevik, aren't you?" said Mrs. Cat. She turned to Miss Chloe. "We do not need this, Miss Mayhew," Mrs. Cat said. "We do not need anarchists and Negroes." "I'm not an anarchist," said Mr. Martin. "I'm a socialist." "I don't know about you, Mrs. Cat," said Miss Chloe coldly, "but I'm fighting for the right to vote for Negroes, too." Myrtle felt a sudden rush of affection for Miss Chloe. "Fine," Mrs. Cat said, "but that doesn't mean you have to parade your little colored friend around now and scare these old Confederates in the legislature out of voting for suffrage. Do you know what a legislator from Mississippi told me?" There was silence. "He told me," Mrs. Cat went on, "that the reason he was opposed to women's suffrage was that the white men in Mississippi beat up any Negro men who tries to vote, and that he didn't really like the idea of having to beat up a woman. Not even a black one," he said. Ugh, it kind of makes my stomach hurt to read some of this, you guys. Myrtle stared at Mrs. Cat. She couldn't tell if Mrs. Cat thought this was a bad thing, or a good thing, or just a thing. "So keep your little colored friends and Bolsheviks hidden, please, until after the vote. Do you know how long we fought to reach this moment? 72 years, Mrs. Cat said. 72 years, do you hear me? And now at the scene of the final battle, you play games, you wear the enemy's colors, you treat the culmination of our years of sacrifice as if it were nothing more than a game of... She seemed at a loss to say what kind of game it was, and Myrtle wasn't about to suggest one. Mrs. Cat was a frightening old lady. "Chloe, I really need to tell you something," said Violet. "I beg your pardon," she added as an afterthought. Myrtle had noticed that Violet's well-bred manners had been steadily deteriorating ever since they'd met. Personally, Myrtle thought this was a great improvement in Violet. What Myrtle knew about white people with well-bred manners was that they required servants to wait on them, and Myrtle was against that. Violet looked at Mrs. Cat as if trying to decide whether she could be trusted, and then apparently decided she could. On what grounds, Myrtle couldn't imagine. Violet hurriedly gabbled out something about a plot to kidnap one of the self-legislators, although she wasn't sure which one. "Mr. Hanover," said Mrs. Cat promptly, "our floor leader in the house. He needs a bodyguard. I've been saying that all along. I have Mrs. Dudley talk to Governor Roberts about it immediately." "Is he really a foreign Bolshevik?" said Violet, interested. "No, he's a lawyer from Memphis," said Mrs. Cat, "but I believe he came from Poland as a child." "Who is this fellow you said you heard talking about it?" said Miss Chloe. "Someone named Mr. Garlick," said Violet. "I hadn't seen him before tonight." "A mystery man," said Mrs. Cat grimly. "We've run into the mystery men in every single state. They always show up when the legislature is debating the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Nobody ever knows where they came from." The hotel bellhop came out on the veranda. "Excuse me, ladies," he said. Then his eyes rested on Myrtle. "I beg your pardon, but we don't allow colored people in the hotel." "Come along, Myrtle," said Mr. Martin. "Excuse us, ladies." "I'll go talk to Mrs. Dudley now about that bodyguard," said Chloe. "After you do that, let's all go out for ice cream," Mr. Martin suggested. "In the alley," Myrtle muttered as she followed Violet and him off the veranda. And that's the end. So, sounds like things are kind of heating up. Lots of inequality conversation here between blacks and whites. and just lots of dirty business that the antis conduct in order to try to get legislatures on their side. Paying them money, obviously we know, paying them with alcohol, trying to keep them away from the legislature itself, have them stay home. So pretty dirty. They fight pretty dirty. All right, I'll leave you there.